Hey everyone, Bob is here in the house ready to talk about chemotherapy. And not a fun topic, but I need to share this information with everyone in case you or your loved ones ever have to go through it. There's a lot to consider. So, this is actually going to be 3 videos versus having one long 30-minute video. I'm going to try to do 3 shorter videos. And this first video has to deal with chemo and the considerations you have to think about with side effects. So the chemo process itself, is pretty invasive, and we'll get to that. But the first thing, and one of the big decisions I had to make, was about moving forward with chemo, given all of the side effects that you are going to encounter. And so the particular chemo that you get will be different depending on the cancer that you have. In my particular case, being colon cancer that had metastasized, it's called Folfox. And there are other versions, and these versions do slightly different things depending on what's happening with your body. Now, of course, in my case, my body wasn't reacting the way it needed to. I was still going to do Folfox, but of course I had to do even more chemo drugs. And that's going to come later. But first, let's just talk about side effects. So side effects of chemo are pretty extreme. And the reason for that is you're talking about this invasive chemical that's going into your body to destroy the evil, the cancer. But it doesn't always know that it's just cancer. It also kills the good stuff. And so it's not really discriminating. It's just going to start killing everything. And, as much as they do have the chemicals and the wherewithal to try and target it as much as possible, it's still killing a lot of good things. So some of the side effects are not that extreme, but many of them are. The first one they're going to talk to you about is nausea and vomiting, and that's a very real thing. And so they're going to give you drugs for that, but you are going to go beyond that. So you're not just going to have side effects around nausea and vomiting, which is what most people hear. Risk of infection is a very big deal. So you have to be very careful with the foods you eat. You have to be very careful with what you touch, what you're near. Even with like my dogs, I couldn't let my dogs anymore lick me. That would be a no-no. So the reason why the infection problem is such a big deal, all of your white blood cells are being depleted, and it just increases your chances of not being able to fight off an infection. So there's always a good chance that someone can go through chemo and actually have a problem with infection that could be life-threatening. So very serious. In addition to that, you have bruising and bleeding, anemia, numb or tingling hands, peripheral neuropathy, which can get more extreme. The neuropathy can happen in a couple of ways. There's you can't touch anything metal. Anything metal that you touch will feel like you're holding an icicle at 50 below degrees. It burns. So just to let you know, when I did do chemo, I literally couldn't open up the refrigerator, all metal. I couldn't touch something in the refrigerator. It was all too cold. You can't touch too cold. You can't touch too hot. Yet all your food it has to be a minimum of 160 degrees. And so you're actually overcooking your food in many cases to make sure that you don't get poisoned in any shape or form. But then you have to let it cool off because it's too hot. It's just mind-blowing, right? It goes back and forth. Your whole world becomes very gray, very lukewarm. And I did touch the car handle after a chemotherapy treatment. Felt like, this massive electric shock and burn. So you learn to wear gloves if you're going to have to touch anything. Mineral water, pop, whatever in a can, room temperature. Because you're also on the inside of your body, your palate can't handle it either. It will reject that. So the neuropathy also will get into the nerve endings. In fact, I'm still having a big problem with this finger here where it really hurts to touch, but the nerves will just go crazy and they'll just throb in pain. So a lot of problems with that. Then you have mouth sores that will develop, loss of appetite, fatigue is massive. You're going to deal with a lot of fatigue. And then we have all the other things that can happen. Skin rashes, itching, shivering, dizziness, being hot or flushed, headaches are a massive problem, breathlessness, swelling of your face and mouth, pain in your back, your stomach, or your chest. I even encountered a side effect that wasn't normal. I started lisping after a certain combination of my drugs, and I literally couldn't stop. I'd just be like, so what are you saying to me? I mean, I could not articulate. Everything came out with like I had a speech impediment. It was very interesting. The way I got around it was then I'd have to take a Benadryl. The Benadryl acted like an allergic reaction deterrent, and then the lisping would stop for a bit, and then of course I get really tired, and then I still couldn't sleep. Insomnia is a big side effect of chemo. You are pretty much awake 24/7, which is not healthy because you need to sleep. Otherwise, you can't rejuvenate. Throat spasms, you thought I was done. Pain in your veins. Diarrhea, constipation, shivery, needing to pee frequently. Hooray. I think that's covering most of them. Oh, and there's one that they don't talk to you about. Oh, hair loss, redness of palms and hands and feet, skin changes, other types of skin changes, wheezing, temperature changes, although I was running cold almost all the time, but some people go the opposite direction and end up having high temperature. Heart palpitations, eye problems, bladder effects, hearing changes, blood clot risks. Are we having fun yet? There's a lot of side effects to chemo, and this is why I'm sharing it all with you. And I'll talk about the one major one here in a second, but the reason why you need to be aware of this stuff is that it depends on your tolerance. Now, I think we talked about before, chemo is by weight and volume, so I have to take 3 times the amount of chemo that a smaller person would, and that means it's much greater chance of getting these side effects. And I've always been the kind of person that's not been very lucky. I've had to work very hard. I don't luck into it. I have to study. I have to work for the win. And if there's something that's going to go wrong or could go wrong, Murphy's Law, it usually happens to me. And that's where we're going to go with, upcoming videos talking about all the things that happened based on chemo. So you have to really consider this. And I will tell you what you're going to get when you talk about these side effects. They're going to say, we have a drug for that. We have a drug for that. That won't happen. That never happens. We don't see it happening very much at all. Notice how the rhetoric changed. That doesn't happen. That never happens. It doesn't happen very much at all. Well, not happening very much at all means it still happens. I'm an analyst. I crunch the numbers. I look at the data. I figure it out, and I have to plan for it. And so one big side effect they don't talk about is called Chemo Brain. It's not supported in the medical industry a whole lot, but everyone knows it happens. And what happens is the chemo gets into your body, and the chemo affects your brain, your synapses, and they don't fire the way they normally do. And you can feel like you've lost your faculties. You can feel that you can't articulate things, and you can't. And I will tell you more about that later based on a major decision I had to make. So I talked to the oncologists and the staff, and I said, look, the 2 things that I'm most concerned about, because they had assured me they've got drugs for everything to keep me going. And I would read stories on the internet like, oh yeah, I took my kids to work, I did my chemo, took the kids to work, or I took my kids to work. That would be awesome if your kids are working. I took my kids to school, I went to work, everything was fine. Yes, there were hard moments, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I only wish that were the case for me. But this chemo brain became a very big issue, as well as mouth sores. And I said, these are the 2 things that I can't afford. First off, no one wants a public speaker that's going to have massive amounts of mouth sores. They're not going to want to look at that. And it's hard enough looking at the guy with the purple hair, right? So the other thing is I can't afford Chemo Brain. I live by my faculties. I live by my ability to articulate and share information because I coach and I teach and I mentor and, I do speeches and all that stuff. And they said, it's not going to be a problem. Okay. So after everything was said and done with all the side effects, I said, okay, I will move forward. I will do chemo. All right. So we're going to speed forward. And it's the first day of chemo. And I made them wait 20 minutes because I had a freak out moment. I was second guessing the whole process because I'm looking around the hospital and I'm seeing what's happening. And although the rooms are very comfortable, there's a nice big leather chair, there's a television, it's reclining, they bring you water, they bring you treats if you need it. They do everything they can to accommodate to make it easy. I panicked, and I finally decided, what, if I don't take that risk, if I don't move forward, I will never know. I have to at least try, because this could be something that, in fact, is good for me. So that was my first kind of dual first decision. After getting through all the side effects and the assurances I had and being there in the moment and then getting more reassurances. And so I went through the process. And the process, by the way, for me was about 7 hours long. Now, that is much longer than what most people go through, but I had lots of complications. So I had a complication of that my cancer had a mutation, so the drugs wouldn't be able to get in as effectively, so I had to take another dose of medication before they gave me the chemo. And keep in mind that that chemo was 2 massive things, boxes of wine, I'd like to call them, because of how big I am. And then I also had to get additional fluids, and I also got additional drugs to deal with the anti-nausea. So I had drugs before, pills. I took I want to say it was 5 pills before of different kinds of medication, and IV stuff afterwards. And so it's a very lengthy, traumatic process. And you would think, I'm going to get a lot of time to watch TV and stuff. Nah, that's not how that worked. I had my iPad, and every time I would start something, in would walk a new nurse, So chemotherapy is a crazy process because every nurse that does something with the chemo or the blood draws or anything has to have another nurse verify it. So the 7-hour process, and somewhere between 8 and 12 different people would see me. By the way, that's going to factor in another big decision coming up. So what I'm trying to get to is that there's a lot of side effects. It's a complicated process, and it will be easier for some and harder for others. But my decision at that point was to move forward. And that's where I'm going to stop here, because that's where everything changed.